Hello, my name is Joanna Bourke and I'm Professor of History here at Birkbeck, but I'm also the Principal Investigator for the Shame Project. And today I'm really excited to be able to talk to Professor Avtar Brah. She is Emeritus Professor of Sociology here at Birkbeck. I think you arrived at around 1985. But I guess the thing about Avtar is that she's a pioneer of diaspora studies, and she's focused most of her career on questions of culture, of politics, of identity, really looking at it through a feminist and a post-structuralist lens. But before we talk about your ideas, Avtar, can you just tell us something about yourself?
Well, Joanna, it's a pleasure to be here with you. I was born in India, but I was really about 5 years old when my family went to Uganda. So I actually grew up in Uganda, did my A-levels there. And after doing my A-levels, I went to California to study. And so I was in America for 4 or 5 years. Well, I did my master's there as well. So I was there for 5 years. And then I came to Britain at a time when Idi Amin had come into power in Uganda. And I was my plan was to spend a little bit of time in Britain, just as having a holiday really before going back to Uganda. But of course, Idi Amin decided that all Asians had to leave Uganda. And so I couldn't go back. I actually became stateless. So I was stateless for 5 years. And that's how I ended up actually living in Britain. So that's really, in a nutshell, is my background.
Yeah, and it was 1985 you came to Birkbeck, is that right?
In 85, I came to Center for Extramural Studies, but we actually formally merged with Birkbeck in 1988. So I've been with Birkbeck since then. Until I retired, yes.
Yeah. I mean, as I said in my introduction, you're well known for your work on diaspora studies. I'd just like to get a little bit from you about your theoretical ideas. You made such huge advances in terms of Black studies, in terms of gender, in terms of questions of intersectionality. Can you tell us something about that? I mean, people who are listening may not know what intersectionality, for example, is. Can you tell us something about your theoretical approaches?
Right. When I was working on diaspora studies, I obviously realized that you can't actually talk about diasporas as if they were homogeneous people. People live in their diversity. And so I started thinking about how to think about the groups I was interviewing, I was having conversations with, how to think about them in relation to their gender, in relation to their class, in relation to their ethnicity. Those were the three categories I was kind of most involved in at that time. And I didn't call it intersectionality because intersectionality as a term, as you know, emerged in the US through the work of Kimberly Crenshaw. But when I was using these intersections, I actually used the term intersectionality, but not in the sense that Kimberly used it later on. So I was basically talking about the relationships, interrelationships that you think, sociologically speaking, between gender, between class, between ethnicity, or racialized formations. And that's the way in which I came to intersectionality. Intersectionality, as you know, people talk about precisely these interrelationships, and they include sexuality and disability and age as well, and which is great. So one is actually talking about the ways in which these vectors or axes of differentiation, how they intersect, both in terms of socially, psychologically, psychically, and in terms of embodiment. So that, to me, is what intersectionality specifies. And most importantly, I think, it's important to bear in mind that intersectionally, when we talk about axes or vectors, that they're actually vectors of power. So when we talk about gender or we talk about class or race, we're talking about vectors which are embedded in power relations of a variety of kind.
Why do you think this has proven so productive, these concepts proven so productive, both intellectually, obviously, but also politically? And maybe that is a false distinction, but why so useful?
I think I mean, theoretically, I think they're important because make us think about these interrelationships, the complexity of interrelationships, and I'll come to that later. But also in terms of politically, I think, I mean, one of the productive insights of feminism was that woman was not a homogeneous category. I mean, that was one of the sentences we all remember from early readings, and that we embody heterogeneity. You know, we are racialized. I don't use the term belong to races because I don't believe there are races. We are racialized, we are ethnicized, and we are gendered. We belong to certain social classes. So in that sense, you know, there are ways in which we are kind of, you know, our experiences are marked by these social differentiations. So in that sense, embodiment becomes quite important.
Yeah.
What does it mean, for example, to be an Asian woman in Britain in a racialized context? And not just racialized, but orientalized, which is a particular form of racialization. So it's questions like that, which in fact are very real. I mean, true people, just leaving aside anything intellectual, they matter a lot to us in terms of our everyday social reality. So that's why I feel it's quite important.
I mean, one of the things I've learned from your work is to be very careful about language. For example, using minoritized communities as opposed to minority communities, or avoiding ideas of, you know, minorities or marginal identities, which of course assumes that there is this center. And I think when I was reflecting about what I wanted to talk to you about today, I was reflecting on those issues and thinking, well, actually, these for you, these are not only academic, intellectual pursuits, but they're deeply embedded in your life as an activist. And I would be really interested to hear more about the activist side of your career.
Mhm. Well, I mean, in the first instance, I was obviously quite involved in anti-racist struggles. When I first came here, there were quite a lot of issues around immigration control specifically. I think 1971 Immigration Act was passed soon after I came to Britain, and there were a lot of campaigns around those pieces of legislation that were going through. And I became involved in those sorts of political campaigns. And then questions of racism. Of course, that's something that if you are a person of color, it's something that kind of, you know, marks your life. Not necessarily in any kind of very sort of explicit way, but in the many different and subtle forms in which racialization takes place, you know. So on the one hand, it was my experience in different contexts, which racialization became real to me. But in another sense, it was also about uh, taking shape, questions of racism taking shape in a much more political sort of way. And so that became part of my politics. Later on, so racism and campaigns around immigration, that was the first thing that I became involved in. Then while I was doing my PhD, I did my field work in Southall in Middlesex. I was living in Bristol at the time, and I came to Southall to interview young people in schools, And while I was there, I actually then did my field work, but 2-3 years later came to live in Southall, because when I finished my PhD, like all of us, I didn't actually have a job. And so I had to find a job. And I got a job, not as an academic, because I didn't have my PhD then, but I had a job as a community worker. So I came to Southall to work as a community worker. And while I was in Southall, I don't know if you will recall 1979, when the National Front, this was obviously 1970s, was the period when National Front was very active. And 79 was when the National Front came marching into Southall. They had actually got permission from the council to march in Southall, which obviously those of us who were living in Southall said this was very provocative. But the council actually went ahead and gave them permission. So there was actually a very large contingent of people, not just from Southall residents, as well as people from outside Southall, who came to protest against those meetings that were taking place in the town hall. But after that, there were altercations between the people who came as part of the National Front. Police presence was huge that day. I don't know why, but of course, in their wisdom, they decided to call a very large number of police people there. So there was quite a lot of altercation, and there was sort of, you actually had people beating people, and particularly police. There was quite a lot of police violence, and I think there were about 700 people were initially what's the word? They were not charged, but they were arrested. And about 300 something, I forgot the precise figure, but it was 300 something who were subsequently charged and had to appear in courts all over London, basically. And so there was a lot of violence, a lot of sort of altercation, a lot of sort of, what I can't even remember the words. I get quite emotional about that day. And so in that context, once that day finished, there were a group of us women, young women at the time. We used to be getting together to think about our position as women. And it was sort of a feminist group, but it was before the 23rd April 1979, when all this trouble happened. Before then, we were a fairly small group, fairly informal. But after that day, we actually formed ourselves into Southall Black Sisters. And so that was actually, has been quite an important activism within Southall Black Sisters, has been part of my political history. And we met regularly, and Southall Black Sisters is still going strong, actually. And they now, in fact, have a center in Southall where they've done a lot of work on domestic violence, particularly. And I think they're still doing that. And of course, immigration controls. And I think they also do quite a lot of work in terms of benefits for people. So that's how I really that's my activism. I felt when I was writing my thesis on the one hand, when I was in Southall, and I was working as a community worker and getting involved in Southall Black Sisters. And so the two together came for me in my intellectual work. Also, I was thinking about racism and these sorts of questions about gender, etc. And these sort of merged really in my work. So my work has been very centrally informed by political activism.
I mean, this is very interesting for us, the Shame people in the Shame Project, because we look at sexual violence, domestic violence as well, in relation to medical and psychiatric aspects. But of course, by its very nature, we are involved in political interventions and negotiations, and this dialogic exchange that you're talking about, I think, is really, really important.
Yes.
I just want to finish just by one quick question. Can you tell us some of the challenges that you have felt, that you've experienced in your career, both in terms of an activist and in terms of an academic? What are some of those challenges?
It's difficult to talk about sort of challenges within the academy. I mean, the academy sort of takes pride in being kind of, open-minded and enlightened and everything else. But we know as women, as racialized people, ethnicized people, there are all kinds of ways in which you get othered. And there are subtle forms, more subtle forms, obviously in academia, because it's not crude expressions that happen, obviously. But in many, many subtle forms, you become minoritized and you become othered. I think that's probably the appropriate word for it. So I think life within academia was not that easy. Although I had a group of women in the continuing education faculty with whom I got on very well. People like Mary Kennedy, people like Jane Hoy and Nell Keddy. We all got on very well together and we supported one another. As you know, Mary Kennedy was working on gender issues and Jane Hoy was working on lesbian issues. So we worked together and we kind of supported one another. So in that sense, my academic experience was very positive as well. But at the same time, there were also these more subtle pressures that I can't really put into words, but they are there. Within the challenges within outside were obviously when you're trying to organize around gender and around sexuality, around questions of those kind. It's quite important that we recognize that those sorts of differences are addressed in very complex ways in society. And sometimes they can be quite direct sort of impact on you as a person, I mean, when I came to Britain first time, I was called a Paki for the first time when I came to Britain. Because interestingly, when I was in America, and I'm going back, a long time ago, obviously things have changed in America a lot as well now. But when I was a student there weren't that many Asians in Davis, UC Davis, it was where I was studying. And that was an agricultural college. And it was not actually, there weren't that many Asians there. Although you would find them in San Francisco. And obviously there are very long-standing communities of Asians in places like Yuba City, but I wasn't there. So in those sorts of contexts, I didn't really experience things like racism in that sense. But when I came to Britain, within a very short space of time, I was called a Paki. And that was I was quite taken aback when that first happened. Later on, obviously, I became much more involved and realized that was sort of a commonplace experience for many people here. So so outside the academy, it was more sort of, those kinds of experiences. Within the academy, there were many positive experiences. There were also more subtle forms or othering.
Look, thank you so much, Professor Avtar. I really appreciate that you've given the time to talk to us today. I mean, you've been an inspiration, literally a huge inspiration in my own work and my own thinking. So I'm really honored to be able to talk to you. And I hope that at some later stage, we can even continue this conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks very
Thank
much.
you, Joanna. It's lovely to see you. Lovely to see you.